We're a little bit late, and I think all the speakers know they have a great challenge, which is to keep you going until refreshments and finish and a movie at 5 o'clock. But indeed, yes, there's one of the original movies, the refugee movie, is going to be shown during the reception. But I think these have been some wonderful discussions today, and the idea in this last session was to get two young scholars and policy experts in the space to give us their thoughts, and then we'll come back to our two commission members to reflect on the day and let's hear what they thought of it. But I'm going to start with Eleanor, who, as you will see from the bios, is at Manchester University and a historian of humanitarianism, which in itself shows how far we've come. I struggled with the word when I first heard it in the commission, and now it has a historian. And so, Eleanor, I'm going to start with you, if you wouldn't mind, just that historical perspective. How much has it changed and evolved, and how much, as we've kept on saying today, are we in some ways, going round the same circles?
Thank you so much for that question. And I must say, having worked on the history of humanitarianism, it's been a really fascinating day today, because in a sense, history is everywhere in these discussions, but also nowhere. It's very hard to grasp some of the dynamics that we're talking about, and to what extent have they been forgotten? To what extent are they being revived? To what extent have those legacies been underpinning a lot of other discussions since the work of the Commission? So I've really, I think I've actually got more questions and answers from listening today. But I will just make a few comments about this notion of kind of humanitarianism over time. So it'll probably be a kind of familiar concept to everyone that we have a diverse church of kind of meanings of humanitarianism, both in the past and in the present. Now, of course, that's a kind of a bit of a platitude. It won't tell you an awful lot. So we need to think a little bit more about which circles are we talking about when people understand humanitarianism. So this kind of broad set of meanings that we see historically reflects also a broad set of meanings today, but I think those circles of who have worked with which definitions have changed. So just to give you a little bit of an example about what I mean there are a couple of histories of humanitarianism written around the beginning of the 20th century. Sorry, there are many being written actually now, but around the beginning of the 20th century, we had a couple of histories of humanitarianism, one of which mentioned the Red Cross as sort of one movement of what we might think of as social reform amongst many. So the Red Cross was in there, but it was in there as a sort of a partner amongst other kind of organisations and kinds of movements. The other one didn't actually mention the Red Cross at all. And it would be impossible to write a history of humanitarianism now without the Red Cross being part of that narrative. And we can think about that kind of Red Cross meaning of humanitarianism as a kind of master narrative within the debates around humanitarian action. So one of the things that I've thought about in the history work is how that kind of Red Cross meaning of humanitarian, which is a little narrower, I've already heard today about organisations that might be doing relief work but aren't humanitarian, that kind of circumscription of what it means to be humanitarian, I think has actually come to dominate the kind of conversations we're having today in a way that it didn't used to in the past. So the kind of what we understand when we talk together compared to how a humanitarianism might be understood outside of this room, I think is one of the dynamics that we do have to kind of acknowledge as we're thinking about both the past and the future. In terms of the work of the Commission, I think it's really interesting, and actually it's very explicitly stated that the ICIHI was working with a broad understanding of what humanitarianism was. And when I was reading the final report, Winning the Human Race, I was really struck how little jargon there was in there actually. It's so accessibly written. It's written without kind of technocratic terms. without very narrow definitions. And I think that that combination of a broad engagement with an avoidance of jargon allows those historical connections to come to the fore. So the section, for instance, on child labour really harkens back to a kind of 19th century attitude towards humanitarianism, or one of the facets of humanitarianism in that period, and they're able to make that connection partly because they're not sort of subject to these sort of narrower stovepiping of agendas. I wanted to make a point about this sort of idea of are the questions around humanitarianism perpetual, or are they perpetually new? And again, perhaps unsurprising from a historian, I would say these are really recurring questions. I think these sort of issues around who might be in need of assistance, how they might access it, on what basis others seek to provide assistance, and what the distances they cover are. So whether we're talking geographical distances or sort of emotional distances, if you like, how we think about the closeness of others or their removed from us. I think these are really perpetual questions in humanitarianism, but they get asked in different ways in different times, and the kinds of answers that we propose to those questions do very much shaped by their era. To slightly illustrate that point, I thought I'd just pick up on this idea of crisis, which is the sort of final reflection I want to sort of throw into the mix for now. So we've heard about a couple of kinds of crises today. We've had a crisis of compliance. Jeff mentioned the idea of a protection crisis, the refugee crisis, and this notion of humanitarianism in crisis has become more or less axiomatic, certainly in terms of the public-facing materials that aid organisations put out. So are we experiencing a crisis of aid at the moment? And I wanted to refer you back to a line that I found particularly striking from the report here, which I think thinks about crisis in a slightly different way. So here, it's in the context of a discussion about nuclear disarmament, where the author is calling for individuals, governments, and world leaders never to accept the status quo as being anything other than a dire threat to the survival of the human race. So here we're talking about a kind of crisis, but not a perpetual crisis for humanitarians, but status quo itself as a kind of crisis which needs to be confronted in different ways. And I wanted to put that to you. You might agree or disagree with my characterization of that, but just to emphasize the point that the stories we tell about the present and drawing on the past really shape the way we approach the future. And Saba, the point that you made about who that we is, who has the right to tell a story about the state of the world and about the response to the world, I think is a really essential issue and something that perhaps needs a little unpicking in the way we're telling the story of the Commission today. Thank you
very much. Ben, you've done a lot of thinking about the system, and you've heard today that the humanitarian system is broken in a lot of different ways, and it in a sense comes a little bit back to the last point about crisis. Is it as broken as we all gloomily think today, and is it fixable?
It's an interesting question. Thank you, Mark. Thank you to my fellow panellists. I think it is clear that the humanitarian sector is facing a series of new and long-standing challenges. And most of this is driven by the context that we operate in. So our 21st century world is simultaneously more developed, more wealthy, and more unequal and more degraded. We're growing faster and we're ever more resource constrained. We're more technologically capable, but we're still more fragile and more vulnerable than ever. And I think it's fair to say that opportunity has been globalized, but so too has vulnerability. Our world's been designed as an engine for perpetual growth, but it's perhaps more accurately described as an engine for perpetual crisis. And I think this globalized, interconnected engines also created a lot of turbulence for the humanitarian sector, both at the policy and at the operational levels. It's pushed agendas and efforts in lots of different directions simultaneously, and it's created what might be described as a perfect storm of challenges, political and social attitudes and norms, new kinds of crises that are compounding with each other, and a whole host of operational organizational issues that have been addressed at best imperfectly. And the humanitarian sector has responded. I don't think it's broken because it has actually responded. A broken system wouldn't respond at all. And I think it's expanded. It's done so by expanding the caseload. It's become more diverse in the ways that Eleanor described. It's become more professionalized, more institutionalized, all the I's that Antonio talked about earlier. Now, it has grown. It's fourfold bigger than it was 10 years ago. But in market terms, the growth hasn't been matched by the growth in demand. The shortfall in 2015 was reckoned to be something like 15 billion. So I think clearly the system is stretched financially. But, and its defenders say, it's not broken, but it is broke. And when you actually consider the sums that are spent on humanitarian assistance, so some 0.03% of total global annual GDP is spent on humanitarian assistance. Josette used the figure of annual bonuses for humanitarian bankers. My favourite comparison is that actually we spend the same on humanitarian assistance as we do on chewing gum each year, roughly 26.3 billion a year. And so it becomes very easy when you look at those comparisons to have sympathy with these not broken but broke arguments. But the reality is when you look across every aspect of our global system, whether it's the military, whether it's diplomacy, whether it's food, whether it's security, whether it's democracy, a quick Google search will convince you that all of these systems are also broken and also broke. And so if all of our patients manifest the same problem, David Owen as a physician will hopefully back me up here, we should wonder whether this malaise is not to do with the patient, but about the system we have created in which these patients operate. And if the humanitarian sector and all these other sectors are showing us a reflection we don't like, are we going to blame the mirror for it, or are we going to actually start reflecting on the system that we're creating? Instead of all imagining that these things, these problems that we face are the problems of the system, I think that actually, Mark, it goes back to something that you've written about and talked about in the past, that they're a manifestation of a failure of global governance, a deficit of global democracy. And I think it's true that the humanitarian sector is a particularly clear manifestation of this failure of global governance. And I think because of this failure of global governance, it's no longer fully fit for purpose in either conception or in execution. So it's certainly not broken, but it's far from perfect. It's changed over time. It's incorporated many different movements. It's been incorporated into development efforts. It's managed a whole series of internal tensions. And its imperfections are all too clear. It remains top-down. It remains mechanistic. It remains context-free, technically obsessed. I'd call it, as a scientist and a business person, neo-Newtonian and neo-Fordist, because simply it is not suited to the challenges of a complex and changing world. Political scientists like Mark might evoke notions of perverse incentives and talk about the failure of collective action to improve humanitarian assistance. Future specialists like Randolph might say that actually it's a problem of being stuck in a model of predicting the future rather than anticipating the future. And if we continue to try and predict the future, then we're doomed to repeat the past. Behavioural scientists would talk about the biases that we're driven through the system, the cognitive and operational biases that mean that we continue to deal with problems in ways that we define them, not defined on the ground. Group psychologists might draw on ideas from Lord Owen of institutionalised hubris and ask why it is we're able to repeat the same actions and see the same failures time and time again and still not see any reduction in our legitimacy or our ability to work. So I think, Mark, in your work on the global revolution, you talked about this issue of global governance and the deficit of global governance. And I think there are all of these kinds of deficits that we see in the humanitarian sector, a number of different crises of legitimacy. So for those who call for humanitarian assistance, the governments of the world that need to essentially ask for and demand humanitarian assistance, they're increasingly seeking alternatives to having a whole load of uncoordinated crap dumped on their doorsteps. That's a quote, by the way, from Kevin Rudd, who was the foreign minister for Australia, when asked, is Australia going to accept foreign aid? He also oversaw a doubling of Australia's foreign aid budget, because clearly humanitarian assistance is something which is more blessed to give than to receive. For those who fund it for political or personal reasons, who place the system under increasing pressure to change, they're doing so in order to make the system more attuned to their own interests, the top-down interests and their goals. For those who implement it, they can see most clearly the mismatch between resources and needs, and they call for more resources. For those who try to coordinate it, who see the duplication and the waste generated by the self-interest within the system, they see the lie of the broke system most clearly. For those who subcontract it, the invisible workhorses of southern partners, and the conversations you have with them that are no different to the small supplier in any global value chain. They feel squeezed, they feel sidestepped, they feel exploited. I think most importantly, for those who receive assistance, and they see the system as opaque, as unpredictable, as hard to navigate, for them, humanitarian assistance is a global and local postcode lottery, and it cannot be relied upon. And they feel either totally ignored or over-consulted, but never, ever listened to. And these, of course, are not new. These are challenges that have been identified time and time again in the 1990s, in the report in the Commission itself in the 1980s. And there are many reforms that have been put forward as part of the answer for addressing humanitarian assistance. And almost every aspect of humanitarian assistance has been put under the lens. So coordination, accountability, learning, information, evidence, technical delivery. One colleague in Geneva listed out 37 separate initiatives for changing their organisation, changing the sector, which they individually had to work on top of their day job, 37. Now, all of these efforts are trying to bring some elements of professionalisation and standards into how we think about and respond to humanitarian crises, and they try and inject this greater quality into how programmes are designed and how they're implemented and evaluated. But actually, the problem is we spend so much time focusing on the content of the reforms that we don't think about the how of the reforms. And I want to give you an analogy which draws from English myth and English history. I think many of these reforms are akin to a kind of holy grail quest of Arthurian legend. This idea that if we get the right content, if we get the grail, then somehow we'll be free of the problems. And all we need to do is seek it out. The right kinds of people need to seek it out, and having sought it, they can use it to shore up their position, shore up legitimacy, and we'll see the change that we want to see. And I think many of the changes that we see are designed in exactly that way, a small group of people that are trying to find the answer and then apply that answer. And I think we need to see reforms that are actually more akin to the Magna Carta and less like the Holy Grail, a means of changing the existing power relationships that takes on more significance over time, a way of protecting against the powerful, against despotism, that creates rights and obligations, that protects freedoms and opportunities, and is a means of taking on the vested interests within the system. And I think the grand bargain of last year after the World Humanitarian Summit certainly had a flavour of the kind of Magna Carta-style reform, but as Antonio and others have well said, it was drawn up by the oligopoly of powerful actors, 15 donors, 15 implementing organisations who command much of the system. It focuses on efficiency rather than the power dynamics. And even its staunchest supporters worry that it now risks becoming a grand sidestep. So I think we need reforms that are willing to see and take on the power and the politics, as Sarah mentioned, within the system. And a system of genuine carrots and sticks. Mark Lowcock was really eloquent this morning, and he said, we need to deal with those who violate humanitarian principles with a rigorous system of carrots and sticks to deal with those who violate and those who uphold the principles. And I think we need an equivalent system of strength for those who would seek to uphold humanitarian principles in action. And if I might just close, there was Tony Benn, who will obviously be known to you, Lord Owen, great British parliamentarian, posed 5 questions that we need to ask powerful people. And I think we could equally ask these of the humanitarian sector. And he said, we need to ask, what power do you have? Where did you get it from? In whose interests do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? And if we can genuinely ask those 5 questions of the humanitarian sector, we may have a start towards addressing the democratic deficit we see. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I think that sounded to me like a system more broken than you began by saying it was. And it made chewing gum look good, actually. But thank you, that was very good. David, you are a politician. You have heard a lot today about how, sort of what we lack is political will, or it's the politics that creates the problems we're addressing. And, it would be all but the most sort of rosy-eyed politician looking forward would anticipate anything other than politics getting harder, not easier. More populism, more nationalism, more inequality in the world, more people claiming that they've got to look after their populations at home, not help the world more internationally. So, in that context, how do we fight for these kinds of humanitarian principles we've been talking about today?
Well, I don't share your pessimism, and I think you have to take a span of history. You quoted Rishi Calder decrying democracy. That is a dangerous path. And it is a dangerous path because time after time we've come back to the fact of life that there is no better system. And nobody's yet been able to produce it. And you have to take decisions. And you are taking decisions here about diverting income from wealthier countries and wealthier individuals, really, to poorer countries and poorer individuals. Redistribution is the hardest thing anyone faces in politics. I'm always been on the left, a social democrat. I'm a believer in redistribution. But you only have to tread the streets of your constituency to realize how difficult it is to persuade people to do this. Now, I'll take you back in history. In 1970, the election started. Labour thought we were going to win the election. We didn't win it. And it was clear that we'd been out of touch with the electorate during our period of having a very large majority. And I'm in Methodist Central Hall, Plymouth, and there is a combined meeting with the candidates brought together by all the different churches. And the main aim of the meeting is to get their MPs to pledge to 0.7% of the aid budget. And we were way, way behind it. And I sniffed at that meeting a way to win my constituency. And this is what it's about, you know, it comes down to power. This was a very large grouping of people who were very clearly angry and were committed. The problem was how to get hold of them. So we immediately set up desks in supermarkets and everywhere else and asked them to sign up, because we couldn't do it in Methodist Central Hall, to sign up for a pledge for 0.7%. And the crucial thing was you had to send their address. You had to put their address. Of course, it was a naked way of being able to write to them. And I then settled down in the evening, cut out canvassing, and settled down and wrote top and tail letters and tried to put into a basic standard letter of why it was vital at 0.7%. When the final count took place in the referendum, I think my majority was down to 400. A recount took place and I still won it. I have absolutely no doubt whatever in my mind that those 400 votes were things. Now, politics is on the margin. I mean, our problem in this country is that largely too many politicians, an election is called and they know perfectly well they're going to come back. It's a matter of no consequence, this election campaign. They're all in safe seats, or relatively safe seats. So one of the ways you can start to deal with it is to try to get a more accountable political system. But don't decry politics, and don't decry that decisions are taken on the margin. Elections are won. Governments lose election more than politicians win them. And when you invoke civil society, which you are right to do, and you are right to, you must not forget the politics. Now, if you start off with a denigrating of the political system, you haven't got a prayer of getting at that political decision-making structure. Dislike them, do everything to curb their ambition, bring them down to earth, all these sort of very good exercises in politics. Now, not much is new in politics. Satire, look at old Punch of 100 years ago, abuse of political leaders, trying to squeeze them and force them and everything like that. These are all constraints that are there. I mean, when I was Foreign Secretary, there's a union of foreign secretaries that you're not rude about each other because you know how bloody difficult the job is. But I mean, I faced a really very serious, a very nasty right-wing support for Ian Smith in southern Rhodesia, capable of swinging the entire Conservative Party to reduce my salary by 1p, which is the way of getting at an individual minister. And I was totally dependent on Jeremy Thorpe, who'd retired as leader, and had a strong affection for Bishop Muzorewa, not misplaced. He was a good man, struggling in a very difficult situation, in many ways out of his depth, and trying to get him, if I offended Bishop Muzorewa or Jeremy Thorpe, I had my salary reduced and I would have been forced to resign. Now, these are political pressures that you live with. Now, you can use these pressures or you can decry them. By and large, you've been quite good at using them. I mean, all the business of involving celebrities. I mean, public does like celebrities. It's a clever thing. And the UN sponsoring and all these different people, provided they don't get into too many beds en route, can be extremely successful. And they are ambassadors for it. So I would say to civil society, by all means strengthen yourself, and essential that you do, because you are part of this whole education process of getting people to accept the redistribution of resources, income, and assets. And I don't share this thing. You know, I think there is a great deal of backlash going on in the world at the so-called democratic system we had. I think that Hillary Clinton was a complete victim of a very general refusal inside the Democratic Party to be governed by Wall Street. I think Jeremy Corbyn is a complete refusal for the Labour Party to be identified with the City of London, and we don't care how filthy rich you get. Most Social Democrats or Labour people do care how filthy rich people are, and they're beginning to show it. And I think in that atmosphere of hostility to absolutely grotesque wealth levels, and particularly for the heads of companies, where the imbalance between the next down 2, 3, or 4, that gap is huge and ludicrous. I believe this is all going to be attacked. In that climate, a well-directed civil society involvement with the political process can produce very substantial sums of money and also a great deal of commitment. And finally, I'll just say this. I've just written a book about British diplomacy in the future, and I had to grapple with this National Security Council. Most of you probably haven't, no reason to get together with it. It does show a very interesting development. I mean, overseas development was under the Foreign Secretary when I was there. There's still people arguing it's just simple to return it to be the Foreign Secretary. What actually this National Security Council has done has put the Minister for Overseas Development on the National Security Council with the head of MI6, the head of MI5, and the head of GCHQ, a central core business of allocating resources in this broad range of security, international aid, defense, cyber, all of this stuff. And I think that's a very big demonstration of how important you are. Apart from anything else, of course, they're all trying to get at the 0.7%. But I think that it's also a demonstration that aid is about security. Now, I think we've all got to put our heads together on some of these things. I mean, it is ludicrous that the British government cannot put money into the BVI at the moment because it's not a poor country, despite the fact that when the typhoon hit them, they were poor and will remain poor for quite a few years. And not to be able to use that. So they're having to use to raid the emergency budget provisions, which then takes away from other aspects of it. So the aid budget, the aid people, the humanitarian world has to grapple with the practicalities of politics. So if I leave you with one message, it is a very simple one. Do not decry to politics. Do not distance yourself from politics. They are what you make them. And I believe there is a great deal of decency in the world, in the public out there. I don't share this disparagement of populism. What the hell does it bloody well mean? Perhaps it means listening to some of the people who vote for you. Perhaps it means taking a damn sight more care and interest about what they think. There's a wake-up call for politicians. During that wake-up call, you've got to be there. And you've got something to sell to them, which is the basic decency of normal, average people, and given a reasonable chance to do it. When the crisis hits us, people dig in their pockets to quite a remarkable extent. They will do it more, and they will get their politicians to do it more if you engage with the political system. Don't disparage it. It ain't marvelous, but we ain't found anything better.
That's good. I think, David, you are in one regard choosing not to completely hear the message about politics and civil society, which is not to say ignore politics. What it's saying is government left to itself will not do the right thing on these issues. So civil society has to pressure government to do the right thing. So I think actually it's consistent, not at odds with what you say. What it's saying is, just don't stand back and expect the governments today to behave benignly and altruistically. We as civil society have to organize to press them. So I think it's actually the story of your Plymouth constituency. I think probably where we disagree is on the populism point, where here the 0.7 may still be the case, but in the US, which is already way down from where we all would like to see it, there is a president who's proposing a 30 to 40% cut in aid levels, which would absolutely decimate humanitarian response there. And so while I think you're completely right about Mrs. Clinton being either the victim or leader of a complacent political establishment in Washington which had lost touch with people, I don't think the remedy is great for the world. Let me just put it that way. And the chairman's right. I'm going to move on now to Prince Hassan. And so, what do you take away from the current status of humanitarianism? What are the issues that, as someone who's not just in the Commission, but engaged with the UN and engaged with these issues all of your adult life, where do you see things going?
May I start by saying that years ago I had a long conversation with Leopold Sédar Senghor, and he was proposing the métissage of Arabs north of the equator and Africans south of the equator, negritude that we shared. Our early beginnings were from Africa, and reading today or yesterday an article in The Guardian by an African commentator, he was criticizing the difference between modernization and westernization. I've been invited to Morocco next year to a conference entitled Al-Hadatha wal-Hadathat, Modernization and Modernizations. And I would like to suggest that people like myself, educated in the West, conform to that very British disclamatory expression, WOGs, Westernized Oriental Gentlemen. And
you do have to spell it out, because most of this audience is too young to remember.
Too young to remember, okay, very well. Well, I'm not too young to remember, because next week I'm addressing the Harrow Association, the old boys, 6,000 of them or 4,000 of them, or whatever it is, of my old school, who for some sin I must have committed in my life have asked me to become the president of the Harrow Association at the Albert Hall. In fact, I was intrigued by the fact that the Albert Hall hosted a few days ago this great enterprise. They were celebrating the Balfour Declaration. I don't quite understand what the common denominator is, but or was maybe, maybe this great enterprise applies to public schools as well. But I'll never forget dear Nanny saying to me, she was, by the way, in the WRAF and had served in Malaysia, in Malaya when they were fighting the communists. And if I was ever that much critical of the British Empire or Commonwealth, she'd say to me, "Oh, Hassan, after all we British have done for you." As though the sole purpose of the Commonwealth was, or the Empire was to serve my best interest. But I just want to say that seeing things through different optics, going back to politics and populism, I remember on one occasion the telephone rang, and my late brother King Hussein was at the table, and he said to me, "Let me just finish my conversation," or whatever it was, and I'll come. And it was Mrs. Thatcher. And she mistook my voice for his. There was some similarity. And I heard this voice saying, the 15th vote on the Extended Security Council and non-acquisition of territory by war, and the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, and she was referring to the Falklands. So, and I'm afraid I just responded immediately off the cuff. I said, why is it that the sheep bells of the Falklands ring louder than the church bells of Jerusalem? And she said, well, you know how it is. Years later, we get into this mess of who was supporting Saddam Hussein, and now, of course, it's all very well because we can talk about the Sunnis fighting the Shia, and this extraordinary concoction of Sunni states and Israel standing up against the Shia. I mean, I don't know what they're on, but they're certainly doing something which is giving them quite a high. And I was, surprised to consider the following. Again, the same Mrs. Thatcher, and London Airport this time, coming back. I should have been chastened, but I wasn't, by various ticking offs by Mr. Baker and Mr. Bush Sr. for being too close to Iraq and so forth. And she says to me, well, how is the King's popularity rating today? And I thought to myself, what do I have to lose? I said, well, very high, but maybe for the wrong reasons from your point of view. And she said, I don't care what the reasons are. And I said, well, on that basis, maybe we can talk about what we share. What we share, coming back to your question, is this extraordinary situation. I mean, first of all, I'm handicapped. I'm a prince, so I mean, anything I say has to be taken with a pinch of salt because I'm a sort of mythical figure, like a unicorn or something like that. So you have to take it on face value that I actually spend time with those kids who we have trained in psychosocial help and who are actually interviewing young people in 300 UNICEF schools. I've had the privilege of visiting many of them in Jordan. They talk to the young people. A young man with a huge stammer is a walking volcano. Unless you actually understand why he has his stammer and do something about it, how to loosen his tongue. And he'll tell you, I don't want to become an air conditioning repairman. I want to play with mobile telephones. And that's what he's doing now and making some money. The young girl who is not allowed to, by her relatives, become a hairdresser. And her mother takes pity on her. She becomes a hairdresser, and now she's enjoying life. The boy with a hernia from pushing a barrow, the brightest button in the family, by the way, but he's not allowed to go to school because it's a seniority system. And so it continues. My question is, and all these decades, we started in the 70s with a regional database. Bradford Morse was the head of the UNDP, if you recall, in our meeting in Buenos Aires. Data became informatics. Informatics became knowledge. And anyone who talks about the digital revolution is 20 years at least out of date. Now we're into Industry 4. The only lesson I have come out with of these decades is that people are talking through when they claim they know anything. Because in our region, we do not have a knowledge base. And I think the sooner that we ground people in universal knowledge of the real situation. I mean, I just asked you earlier, the chairman of the last panel, would you think that a call for a UNGA meeting to discuss the nexus of food, water, and energy might not be a good idea? I mean, here we're talking about climate change, but when nobody talks about the reasons for climate change or the consequences of climate change, everything has to be given in short doses. So I want to know, really, why this whole question of development. We've mentioned the commissions, the Pearson Commission, the Brandt Commission, the Palme Commission, and so forth. Why is some synthesis of all of this can't come about? If we're talking about a world order, can't we, at least by analogy, teach ourselves what we have not been able to teach ourselves by didactic means? It's about time that this exercise of our learning curve was instilled at the leadership level, because quite honestly, I don't see much leadership around at the present time. And this is probably one of our greatest difficulties. You go to INSEAD and you say to the Arab leaders there, will you come back to our part of the world? They say, no, there's nothing to come back to. When the time comes that we are important because of what we know, rather than who we are, then we might consider it. So, you know, I will continue to be the Pied Piper or whistling in the dark or whatever it may be, but I just regret this absence of shared knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. We are fairly pressed for time, but it seems to me some important things have been said and issues raised and not altogether resolved. So if anyone's bursting, and I hope that one or two of you are to come in, my only plea is that you do it quickly. Anyone? Yes. Have we got a microphone over here?
Yeah, hello. My name is Dunia Habash, and I'm from the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford University. And this has been a really enlightening and very thought-provoking day for me. And I just have a question about the human narrative and why it seems to be missing in our reports and policy and discussions. And, you know, where is the refugee voice? Where is the human voice in all of this? And Prince Hassan touched on this a little bit, but I really do think that our obsession with numbers and data and analytics and analysis is really distancing us from the very people that we're claiming to serve in this humanitarian institution. And just to give you an example from my current work, right now I'm doing some research with the resettled Syrian refugee community in Oxford. And it was only after kind of weeks of really engaging deeply with some of the families that I discovered that, you know, they can't even read their own mail because they don't have the language skills. And as you know, in British society, everything happens in mail, you know, your appointments, your bills, your taxes. And I think the service providers just aren't realizing the severity of the challenge of the language barrier because they're not really listening very deeply or asking about the human experience of resettling into another country. And that's just, of course, one element of this entire humanitarian regime. So, yeah, I guess just, you know, why is the voice missing? And is it relevant? Thank you.
Anyone else? I think we are actually coming to a close. I think I'm going to answer the question for you rather than doing a full round, if I may.
May I just say two words?
Yes.
Humanize the stats. We need to humanize those digits. I think this is basically what I was trying to say. Thank you for reminding me.
I'm going to say two things. Talk to the guy to your right, who makes his living surveying refugees on what their issues are. But, you know, I think more generally, I think you're putting your finger on a very good point to close on, which is what we've heard is about a humanitarian sector which has grown 4 times in size, but an audience here today who are skeptical about whether it is having 4 times the impact, and in fact suspect that it has become over-institutionalized, detached from the problems it's dealing with, projectized rather than systematically taking on the issues. And at the foundation of that system's failure is almost certainly the inability to listen closely to what, I was going to say, the beneficiaries want, but even that is the wrong word. And, you know, I do think we've talked a lot, just particularly in this last session, about democracy at the donor country end. I think what many of us also feel is so important is democracy at the global south end. And, you know, when I was running UNDP, I must say I faced a lot of criticism for redeploying a very large portion of its resources away from immediate development activities to the promotion of democracy. And, you know, it was because I was a great student of the writings of Amartya Sen. and believed, and in fact he was my advisor, and believed profoundly that if you gave the poor the vote, issues like famine and access to health and education would start to improve as they exercise their power to demand a better deal from government. And sometimes for those of us in development, that is easier to do than it is in the displacement context of humanitarianism, where it's kind of often harder to get the organized voice of citizens heard and able to exploit their collective power of numbers by voting. And therefore for me, one of the really dismaying trends in the current world is the deterioration of the democratic order. When I was administrator of UNDP, it was a period when dozens more countries moved from semi-democratic into nearly fully democratic. We are now seeing a deterioration in that number, and many of the largest countries in the world today, which comprise a global majority of the world's population, are living in authoritarian systems, which are semi-democratic at best. So, I think these are difficult times. But I do just want to close by thanking a number of people, starting with Prince Hassan and Lord Owen, but also Mark Lowcock, who was with us here earlier, and Josette Sheeran, thank you for your wonderful intervention, and similarly Francis D'Souza for yours, as well as all the other chairs and speakers, to the Rizvi family for their support for this event today and participation. Riaz particularly, thank you for being up here earlier. To Chatham House and Robin Niblett for lending us the premises, and Florence and the events, who was the events coordinator, for all she did to help us make this happen. To Alex's ODI and Sarah's ODI too, for that matter, for support with the whole sort of registration of invitations of people. To the Humanitarian Leadership Academy for the program, which I hope you all agree is a pretty fine-looking document and a fine souvenir of today. And to Sabra al-Mubazlat, who spoke in the last panel and is its head, as well as finally to the Refugee Studies Centre for supporting the streaming and other issues today. And I think Martin and I both feel very strongly to the CRISP family. Jeff, you've mobilized your sons in a remarkable way, Dylan particularly, to support this, and thank you and them. Just that list of sponsors shows that this was an act of love to pull this thing together. An act of memory of an extraordinary experience for all of us who are here, who were involved in the commission all those years ago. Somebody who couldn't make it today is Michael Keating, the SRSG in Somalia. And when I heard of the famine in 2017 averted, well, it's another alumni of this commission who actually has led the UN efforts in Somalia, and because of the recent tragedies there, simply couldn't come and join us today, but like all of us, worked for Prince Hassan and Prince Sadruddin, as well as for Zia on that commission. So, it is an event which has had a lot of emotion for all of us. I promised Riaz, as we conceived of it, that the real tribute to his dad would be if we could find something out of this to carry forward, to keep the spirit of this alive. And, we'll be reflecting on that, because we don't want to kind of, no more commissions, no more, or if they are, they're going to be on food, energy, and water. But I do want to, I think many of us want to find some way of honouring this in a way that continues and goes forward. So thank you all for all your inputs. Thank you for your patience and attention through a long day. And the reward is some drinks upstairs while one of the Commission's films, one of David's movies, Refugees, is I think played silently, or not silently, well, played at least while we have a drink. No popcorn, I think, though. So with that, thank you all very, very much indeed.